Welcome back. You're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig. Organ donation is one of those quintessential debates that raises its head from time to time, and with its implications for how we define both death and life, it's an ethical minefield. The British Medical Association has reopened the argument by saying there should be a fresh debate on organ donation, including controversial measures such as elective ventilation, in essence keeping patients alive long enough to use their organs for transplant, as well as changing the consent needed to donate organs from opting in, such as joining a register, to a presumption of donation or opting out. The situation in the UK is alarming. Almost 8,000 people are currently awaiting organ transplants, and up to 1,000 people on the list die every year before they get them. So do these proposals need to be adopted in order to turn this situation around, or is there a risk of looking at the body as nothing more than a bank of spare parts to be stripped out when we die? To discuss this, I'm joined by Roger Goss. He's co-director of Patient Concern, a patients' rights advocacy group. Dr. Evan Harris is a former Liberal Democrat MP, member of also of the BMA Ethics Committee that produced this report. And Professor John Faber joins me from King's College London. John Faber, let me start with you. The BMA has produced this report, as I said in the introduction, calling for this debate to be opened up. Is it a debate that you think should be opened up?
It should be open because getting more organs is absolutely crucial for the United Kingdom. The document was very disappointing, although it gave an excellent summary of what the situation has been in the UK over the last few years. Its recommendations amount to very little that's new. Essentially, it's pushing the BMA point of view on presumed consent and bringing up fairly peripheral issues like elective ventilation.
Roger Goss, your organisation has some concerns about the recommendations, I understand, and we'll discuss those in a moment. But first, Evan Harris, why has the BMA called for these particular points, such as elective ventilation and opting out, to be discussed more widely?
Well, let's be clear. The British Medical Association has called for the opting out system to be introduced, not just discussed. It's been discussed for a while. That's because we recognise that it's the most ethical approach, both for dealing with the donors, the recipient families and the relatives, and it would be effective. It wouldn't be worth doing it if it wasn't effective, and I think it's the most significant measure that can be taken. I'd be interested to know what Professor Faber thinks the BMA should have recommended instead. They also proposed that we do, as you say, have a discussion of the issue of elective ventilation, but that's a difficult thing to introduce without at least advance consent from a patient for reasons we can go into, and I think that will be rare enough for it to be a relatively peripheral issue. I think the fundamental question is we don't have enough organs. We have plateaued in terms of, other than living donation of kidneys, for example, we are still in a plateau situation where people are continuing to die while waiting, and we know that organs whose donors wouldn't have minded being used are being lost in the system that could be used to save lives, and that's a crisis. It was a crisis 10 years ago when I had a private member's bill and an amendment to the law to seek to change it, and it's a crisis now, and that's why it's so good that the Welsh have decided to go ahead with introducing the opt-out scheme.
Roger Goss, as Evan Harris says, this situation is it's a difficult situation. I mean, as I said in my introduction, 8,000 people are currently awaiting organ transplants. 1,000 people, up to 1,000 people, die every year. Surely radical action is needed, is it not?
Absolutely, but presumed consent is the one that's least needed. Evan made the point it's the most ethical approach. We think it's the most unethical, that it would be effective. We find no convincing evidence in favour of that. We think there are a lot of other things that need to be done. For example, the most obvious is to pass a regulation that everybody who is a potential donor is consulted, or their relatives, as to what their feelings are on this matter. If you really feel you have to make any legislative changes at all, then the only ethical one you could make is to introduce, albeit I accept it's a bit authoritarian, mandated choice, which basically says everybody who is mentally competent over the age of 18 is required to state whether they are willing to donate, if they're not willing to donate, or if they would prefer to leave the decision to their relatives. That is perfectly acceptable because that way you avoid the risk with presumed consent that large numbers of people who actually object will fail to get around to registering the fact, just as in the same way, arguably, they fail to get around to registering their willingness to join the register.
If that happened, it's hardly a tragedy that lives will be saved. At the moment, when the opposite happens, when people who wanted to donate, their organs don't get used, not only do their wishes not get met, but people die. So if we're going to have the occasional inability to match, we ought to do it in a scenario where people's lives are saved. That clearly must be more ethical.
Most people who donate are not on the donor register, don't carry a donor card.
Exactly.
But isn't this part of the problem that about 20...
It is a small part of the problem, but it's not a colossal problem, for the simple reason that the relatives of the potential donor have the final say, and so that they are the ones that know the patient, know what they might or not have wanted.
But they don't, do they? They have to guess in many cases.
They do, and most times they guess in favour.
Well, 60% of the time they guess in favour, but we know that the proportion of people who would want to donate is far higher than the 50 to 60%.
What is it?
Well, from recent surveys, it's over 70%. And the part of the problem is that when people aren't on the register, and I don't blame relatives for this, they say, was he on the register? No, he wasn't. He must have not wanted to then.
That's actually not the case.
But no, well, that's why we're not seeing the increase that's in fact why we're seeing, if anything, an increase in the number of relatives in those circumstances where someone isn't on the register saying no, because logically, if everyone's heard of the register, yet your loved one isn't on it, it's not an unreasonable presumption to think that they objected. That is often the wrong presumption.
It's not, for the very simple reason that if you tell people go on the donor register, 30% go on. You tell people carry donor cards, 30% go on. You tell people discuss this with your relatives, 30% do that. It's the same 30%. You're rebottling old wine.
That's my point. And what about the other?
The other 70% will
10%
never.
of whom might not wish to donate.
But if you're trying to say that presumed consent is the best way to get the opinion of the 70% who do not go on the donor register, then that's ridiculous.
What we're saying is there's an opt-out. So in other countries where this has worked successfully, it's acceptable and effective, there's an opt-out register which is heavily advertised so that anyone who feels strongly enough that they don't wish to see anyone's life saved after they've died, and that is their choice, and no one would condemn them for it, they can go on that register, or they can tell their relatives, because there would be under our system a check with relatives for any unregistered objection. Okay, but that means the vast majority of people who we know want to donate, the presumption will be that there's authority to take the organs, and it'll be checked with the relatives. And in those countries where this has taken place, we have seen, as far as we can tell, it's very hard to have a control group, a significant increase in the number of organs available and the number of lives saved. And in the end, that's important.
Just a reminder, you're listening to The Voice of Russia with me, Scott Craig, and today I'm discussing the ethics of organ donation with my guests, Roger Goss, Evan Harris, and John Faber. International comparisons are one thing that I wanted to come on to. So just to be clear, Evan Harris, you were saying that there is demonstrable evidence that where presumed consent has been tried in other countries, it has been proven to increase the amount of organs available.
It's not straightforward. So if you look at this from the outset, what's the most positive evidence that you can have? All you could find would be, when you look at countries, across countries, where you try and adjust for road traffic accidents, which is a leading cause of the position where you end up being a donor, or within country, where you go from one system to another within a country, all you could ever do is say that is associated with a higher rate of organ donation. You can never show causality, because it's really hard to have a control. Where everything's the same except you don't change the law, because countries change the law as a whole. Now, in 11 of the 12 studies that were deemed to be high enough quality to consider, there was that association. Now, no one's saying that's proof of causation, but it's about as strong evidence as you could ever get.
Spain does not operate presumed consent. It's consistently had the highest organ donation rate in the world. The United States does not operate presumed consent. It's consistently been around fourth.
Well, so the United States, I mean, I don't wish that we have the number of gunshot head injuries that they have in the United States in this country. But Spain's an interesting. Well, Spain is an interesting example.
Gunshot injuries do not contribute significantly to organ donation, nor actually do road traffic accidents. The major cause of death is strokes, actually. But anyway.
Well, I don't know. In this country's intensive care units, generally speaking, it has traditionally been traumatic head injury that has, including some internal bleeding, but generally traumatic head injuries that has predominated. I don't know the situation in the States. But Spain is interesting because Spain had an opt-out system, and it became so normal to say yes and for relatives to say yes under that system that they never had to operate that system because people generally said yes when relatives were approached. So it's not evidence that an opt-in system works because their law is an opt-out system. It's just that in Spain they have a culture of donation. And I hope that if we change the system here, as Wales will shortly, we'll have the same culture, and then relatives could feel that it's their decision if they want to have that decision.
Well, let me just bring in Roger Goss here because he's been sitting very patiently there. Let me bring you in on this question of presumed consent. If it saves, bluntly put, if it saves lives, shouldn't we do it?
Well, that was the point that Evan was making. If people unfortunately have their organs taken, which they wouldn't have wanted taken, well, that's collateral damage. And it's justified because maybe an extra life, even only one, is dead. We disagree with that because we think that, in fact, the introduction of presumed consent will ultimately end up counterproductive. What you actually have to do in presumed consent is say to people, look, do you have any knowledge of objections by, nearest and dearest? If the person says no, well, in that case, they're eligible to be donors, and we're planning to do that, etc., etc., etc. At the moment, the priority is to help the relatives make the decision that is right for them, that they can live with and will not upset them unreasonably. And if that results in extra availability of organs, that is a bonus. This will turn it on its head. And when people realise, when people find that this is what is happening, people are going to get very upset. I ran a helpline for the Patients Association for 3 years, and I listened to hundreds of people on their concerns. And the one common denominator was, if they felt they'd been treated with disrespect, they'd never forgive the medical profession. Now, the ultimate in disrespect is ignoring your wishes and doing what the BMA, which is actually advocating, which is to say that unless this would cause the relatives serious, unacceptable suffering, then we're going to go ahead. Nobody says what is the definition of extreme or serious suffering. Nobody says who is going to be the arbiter of that. And if and when, as a result of that, you get people saying, this is how they were treated, it will get into the media, the proverbial will hit the fan, we'll be back to the situation where you had the disclosure after Alderhay that over 100,000 organs had been taken without permission, albeit for a different reason, but the principle was they'd been taken without permission.
Doomsday scenario that the sky will fall in has not occurred in any of the countries where it's been introduced. People aren't going to suddenly find that this is the system because we are in a democracy, and in Wales there's been a lengthy consultation and there will be legislation through the Democratic Assembly. But it's also wrong not to think here of relatives. The relatives of those people who are dying while waiting for a transplant. They have a treatable condition, but they are otherwise terminally ill. And it's wrong to disregard them. But the key point I want to make in response to Roger is the idea of looking after the interests of the relatives at the time. We know that not a single relative has ever complained, as far as I know, has ever come to regret the fact that they said, yes, please use the organs of, I authorise you to use the organs of my loved one to save a life or more than one life. But we do know from research that there are relatives who say, I wish at the height of my grief I hadn't said, oh, I don't know what he wanted, I'd play safe, let's leave it intact. And they come to regret whenever they see stories on the news or in dramas or in soap operas of people whose lives have been saved or transformed by organ donation. I wish I'd done that. And I think it's the ultimate cruelty to say to relatives, you have to decide now at the height of your grief, it's all on you. If they knew that there was no objection and no opt-out in a system where people could do that, they could be confident of not vetoing it. They'd still be approached to be allowed to have that veto, so no one who was terribly upset would have organs taken in that situation.